Hey guys! A while back I created this effect of Celina from Fables and Fashion dissolving into a murder of crows. This is a 3D integration effect where I rendered the crows and their shadows in 3D Studio Max and then composited them on top of my original footage inside of Adobe After Effects. Now, 3D integration is a fairly advanced topic and this tutorial won't be any different. You should comfortably know your way around After Effects and you should at least be fairly competent at using a 3D program like 3D Studio Max. Now, I have already created a full 6-part series on how to create 3D integration effects from start to finish, and I will assume that you watched all of those videos. Oh man! Yes, all of them. Just click on one of these links if you haven't yet. This means I will not cover the entire process again. Instead, I will jump through the process and show you the specific elements that you need to set up to create your own dissolve in the crows effect. Now, when I recorded this tutorial, it turned out a lot longer than I expected, so I am going to split this tutorial into 2 parts. In this part, I'm going to show you the 3D Studio Max setup, how to set up the crow particles and the animation, and how to render it out for compositing inside of Adobe After Effects. Without further ado, let's jump right into it. Here's the base footage I filmed with Celina from Fables and Fashion. It's a simple clip of her standing at the end of a pier and spinning around. Rather than just exploding into a murder of crows, I wanted Celina to dissolve gradually from feet to head. For this, the crows need to be spawned to match up with this sweeping dissolve from bottom to top. Since it's silly to try to animate a few hundred crows manually, we are going to set up a particle system in 3D Studio Max to simulate the murder of crows. pFlow, which we are going to use in 3ds Max to control our particles, has a particular type of particle source called a birth texture. The birth texture allows us to set up a plane in 3ds Max to match our scene and assign an animated texture to it that will define where our crows will be spawned during the animation. The brighter the texture, the more particles will be spawned. But first I need to create the texture we will be using. I want to create an entirely black image sequence with nothing but a white stripe moving up Celina's body as she's spinning around to define where the crows will emerge. For this, I duplicated my footage and pre-composed it. In this composition, I rotoscoped Celina out as she is spinning around. Since we are also going to use this cutout during the final compositing phase, it pays to spend a little bit of extra time in it just to make sure it's accurate. Next, I applied the colorama effect to the layer and set the output to a solid white. This gives me a solid white silhouette of Celina spinning around. Going back to the parent composition, I added a simple animated mask to sweep from Celina's feet to her head just as she is turning around. This white strip will define the areas where we will spawn the crows in 3D Studio Max. Of course, we don't want anything on the background, so I disabled my base footage and ended up with a black scene with nothing but the white strip. I rendered this composition out as an image sequence, and you should end up with a bunch of black frames where you only see the white strip moving from bottom to top during the frames of your actor spinning around. Now let's jump into 3D Studio Max so I can show you how to set up your crows effect. As you can see in my project here, I already have my main viewport set up with my animated background of Celina spinning around. As I mentioned, I have already explained how to set all of this up in my 3D Integration VFX series, so I won't repeat it here. Note that I'm currently set up to use the V-Ray renderer in 3D Studio Max, so a few things might look a little bit different, but overall there should only be tiny differences if you're setting this effect up using the default scanline renderer, and I will point those out as we go along. When I scrub through the animation, note that my background will stop animating when it hits the end of the image sequence, but there are still more frames in my project. I made my animation fairly long because even after Celina disappears, I still want to have some extra frames of just the crows flying around. Now, the first thing I did was to model the geometry of the pier that Celina is standing on. You have to make sure that any geometry that has to obscure or receive shadows from your 3D object is modeled as accurately as possible, so do take measurements when you're on the scene. I've put my pier together using just very basic primitives in 3ds Max. Next, I set up the lights for my scene. I added 3 lights in total. The first one is a very large directional light to imitate the harsh sun. I've positioned it at the same angle of the sun so that the shadows of the crows will match my scene. Note that I explicitly enabled the shadows option on this light because I want my sun to cast shadows for the crows. There are a number of options available for the shadows. Mine is currently set to V-Ray shadow map, and if you're using the default scanline renderer, you should probably set it to the standard shadow map. I set the intensity of this light pretty high because it was a very sunny day when we shot the scene and I want this light to be nice and harsh. Also make sure that under the shadow map parameters, your shadow map resolution is sufficiently high. If your shadows are coming all blurry and undefined, increase the resolution of your shadow map. I've also set up 2 other lights in my scene. This Omni light simply illuminates the crows gently from the left side so that the side facing away from the sun does not turn out entirely black. I disable the shadows on this light as it's really just a filler. I also added a very weak ambient light into my scene to bring up any other black areas just a smidge. Fortunately for me, this scene was shot with a static camera, so I did not need to do any camera tracking. I did however have to set up a camera to imitate my real life camera I used to film my scene. I set up a V-Ray camera and positioned it at the same point my real life camera was in relation to Celina and the pier. Whether you're using a V-Ray or a standard camera, you have to ensure that all your camera settings match up with the camera you used to film the scene. These include settings like focal length, aperture, shutter speed, ISO, white balance and more. If you are not setting this up properly, the rendered elements will not fit onto your original footage. Finally, I configured my viewport to use this camera I set up, and the geometry of the pier lines up perfectly with the scene I shot. Let me just hide a few things we don't need to worry about now and get started on setting up our particle system. This is going to get a little more complicated, so hold on to your socks. First, I set up a simple plane to spawn the crows. I placed this plane on the pier and lined it up with the position where Celina was standing. I then scaled it up so it fit perfectly over my scene when viewed from the camera's point of view. I assigned the white stripe texture we created in After Effects to this plane so I can use it to define where our crow particles will be spawned. For this, I used the material editor, which you can open by pressing M. If you go down to the Maps section and open the diffuse slot, you can select the texture image for the diffuse color. I assigned the first image of my white stripe animation sequence to it. Just ensure that the sequence checkbox is ticked and that the number of frames match the animation. When assigning any animated texture to an object in 3ds Max, make sure you set up the end condition of the texture correctly. For me, I want my animation to just hold the last frame once it's done playing. I only want to see the white stripe move across the plane a single time. If we now maximize our camera viewport and play back the animation, we should see the texture animate as expected, and a white stripe should move from the bottom to the top across the screen in time with Celina's rotation. If you set the plane to be see-through in the object properties, you can see that the white stripe aligns perfectly with our underlying animation of Celina spinning around. Now let's get into the scary stuff. Nah, I'm just kidding. It's not so bad, but there is a bit to it, so open up your particle flow view by pressing 6 on your keyboard. This is particle flow, or pFlow for short. It's kinda like Espresso if you've worked in Cinema 4D before, but probably a little bit more high level. These flows define how your particles are generated, how they look and how they behave. You can link different nodes together to have your particles change state and properties and behavior when certain events occur. Every particle flow has a source node that is connected to an initial event that sets up your particles. Note that my event node has a whole lot of things in them, but I disabled most of them since we don't need to worry about them for now. I just want you to have a look at the first item in the node, which is this pFlow birth texture operator. By the way, to set up a new system, you can simply right-click into some empty space in the pFlow view and select New Particle System Empty Flow. You can then drag the birth texture operator that you'll find in the list at the bottom into the view and release it to create a new event node. You can click on the little connector on your pFlow source and drag it over to the new birth texture event to connect them up. Anyways, this isn't meant to be a full tutorial on particle flow, but I just thought I'd let you know how to get started if you've never touched it before. Let's get back to my setup. If you select the birth texture operator, on the right hand side you will see a number of options. The birth texture operator has a start and an end time to define when your particles will be emitted, and if you click on the initializations parameter button just below that, and you return to your main 3ds Max screen, in your modifier panel you can set up all the other options for the birth texture. This is where you can define the number of particles to be spawned, again kinda duplicated the start and the end time of the emitter, and most importantly, the emitter objects. Note that I added the planar setup with my white stripe animation as the emitter object. Also ensure that you tick the animate emitters checkbox since we have an animated material on it. If I now reveal the particle system flow source in my project, which I've kind of had hidden, you should start to see, well, let me just maximize this viewport so it's a little bit easier to see. Little ticks appear in my scene directly over Celina as she's spinning around. These little markers are our actual particles that we will later turn into crows. I think this might be easier to see if I actually disable the see-through property on our plane. Yeah, this is much better. See how the white stripe leaves behind a trail of particles that are being spawned. Let's minimize this viewport again and make sure that this plane does not actually get rendered. For this, go to Edit and Object Properties. Set the Visible to Camera property to false. I'm also going to hide this plane because I don't want to see it in my preview window. Now all you should see is the particles being spawned over Celina as she spins around. Let's get fancy with the particles. Little ticks just won't do. We want actual crows to be spawned, so I imported this crow model into my project. This model was created by my brother for one of his uni projects, and I put a download link to this model in the description of this video. It's fully animated in texture, so it's ready for us to use to create this cool effect. To change your particles to take on the shape of the crow, go back to your particle flow. Down in the list of operators you can find the shape instance operator, and I already added one into my main particle event. You can enable or disable any operators by clicking on the icon on their left side. In the options for the shape instance you can pick any object in your scene and the particles will take on the geometry of that object. You can tweak the size and the size variation of your particles, and for the crow model you should not forget to tick the animated shape checkbox, otherwise your crows will float through space in a rather unnatural way, like without flapping their wings. Also, and this is important, you need to select the display operator in your event and set the type to geometry. Otherwise, you will still just see the ticks in your preview window. Now if we play back our animation, instead of little ticks, we should now see the actual crows being spawned as Celina does her thing. And they all animate properly. However, this effect doesn't quite convince me. Somehow, I don't think that's how crows really behave. Let's modify our particle flow to get the crows to actually fly away from where Celina is standing. For this, I added a number of other operators into my particle event. The speed operator accelerates your particle. You can define into which direction your particles will move, and I want my crows to shoot out horizontally from where they're being spawned. You can set the speed and the speed variation to whatever suits your scene. Next, I don't want any of my crows to fly sideways or backwards, so I added this rotation operator. Now, rather than just rotate the crows in an arbitrary way, I want my crows to face the way they are moving, and you can achieve this by setting the orientation matrix to speed space follow. I also tweaked some of the parameters a little so they are holding their heads a little bit higher. It just looked more natural to me that way. One other thing I added to my particle flow is this keep apart operator. Now, this doesn't always work perfectly, especially if you have a lot of particles with geometry being spawned, but it does help avoid some overlapping issues with all of your crows. The main parameters to play around for this operator are the core radius and the fall of zone settings. Finally, I also added another scale operator. This operator is set to relative first and sync by particle age, which will cause the crows to be emitted with a size of 0 and then slowly grow to their full size over time as they fly away. If we now return to our scene and play it back, look at that! Lots and lots of crows shooting out of Celina as she is spinning. This is pretty cool, and we can kind of start to see the final effect taking shape. Now let's have a look at a few things we can do to improve this effect. If we go to the top view and play back the animation, we can see that all of our crows are moving away from the birth texture plane in a straight line. Not only does this look kind of unnatural, but in my opinion, it also lacks to convey the power of Celina's spin. I want the crows to emerge as if they still had some momentum from Celina's rotation. In order to achieve this, I added a force into my scene. The force I added was a vortex. You can create this force object in 3ds Max by going to Space Warp's Forces. When you select the vortex, you get a whole heap of settings in the model file panel that you can tweak to your heart's content. The most important ones are the on and off time. Now, I wanted my vortex to kick in at full power and then slowly subside as the crows are flying away. So my on and off time are 0 and 100 frames. You can also change the radius of the effect and all sorts of other parameters. Now by default, this vortex will have 0 influence on your crow particles. We can easily fix this by going back into particle flow and adding another operator to link the vortex force and the particles together. In my main particle event, I have this force operator. In the parameters on the right side, I added my vortex force into the list of space warps to be used for this operator. You can also change the amount of influence these space warps have on your particles. If we now play back the animation, note that the crows are spinning around the spot where Celina is standing and slowly straighten out as they fly further away. Looking at this in the camera viewport, this looks much better already. However, there's one problem we need to fix. If you go to your side view and play back the animation, you will notice that the crows are penetrating the ground of the pier. This is not what we want, and it will look rather weird in our final effect when you can see all of these crows sink through the ground and disappear. Now, there may be smarter and more natural ways of getting around this issue, but I solved it by adding a simple deflector into my scene. I made my deflector really big and lined it up with the ground that Celina is standing on. You can find the deflectors in the Space Warps Deflector section in 3ds Max. I just added a standard deflector and I want to use it to stop the crows from passing through the floor of the pier. As with everything in 3ds Max, the deflector has a ton of properties for how to behave during collisions, but I won't get into too much detail on that. Just like with the Vortex force, we need to link this deflector to our particles so that you can actually interact. For this, return to the particle flow and add a collision node into your event. I added my deflector into the list of deflectors and set the collision behavior to bounce. Now, I know crows don't actually bounce when they hit the pier, but I just want to prevent them from passing through the geometry. Also, I didn't bother setting up any deflectors for the sides of the pier as they can cause all sorts of weird crow behavior, and this is a pretty short effect anyways. I ended up doing a few cleanups in After Effects, which I'll get to in the second part. Return to the animation and play it back, and your crows should now remain well behaved and not defy the laws of physics by passing through solid geometry. Let's render out a single frame to see what we've got so far. That actually looks pretty cool. The crows are a little bit too blue, but we can color correct them during compositing. Also, note that if I reveal my alpha channel for the render, the geometry of the pier does not actually show. However, it does show where the crows are casting their shadows. For this, and I have already covered this in my 3D Integration VFX series, I assigned a special material to my pier called a shadow catcher or shadow matte material. If I open up the material editor and select the material currently assigned to the pier, I can show you what that looks like. As I said, I am using V-Ray, and in this case you need to create a V-Ray material wrapper material. Don't forget to assign a standard material to the base material slot or the material won't show at all. Now enable the matte surface checkbox and tick shadows and effect alpha. Your alpha contribution should be set to -1 for this to work properly. If you are using the default scanline renderer, this is a whole lot easier. All you need to do is create a simple matte shadow material. In the options, just make sure that you tick the receive shadows and effect alpha checkboxes and assign it to your geometry. Now, I'm a very picky man, and even though the crows look pretty cool already, I decided to add some floating feathers to the effect so it really looks like a large amount of birds shooting out of Celina and flapping their wings all over the place as they fly away. I'm going to hide the deflector just to get it out of the way. Looking at the spawned crows from the side, I want the feathers to be spawned where the main cluster of birds is, so I generated a sphere and placed it where my particles are being emitted. I then animated the position and the size of the sphere so it moves upwards with the crow and expands as the murder of crows flies off into all directions. I then went into pFlow and created yet another particle system. To spawn my particles, I used a simple birth operator that defines when and how many particles are being spawned. Since I want the feathers to be spawned where my sphere is at the time, I added this position object operator. The position object operator allows you to pick an object in your scene and have the particles be placed along its surface. I selected the sphere I created as the emitter object. I also better enable the display operator, otherwise we won't be able to see our particles at all. If we play back the animation, you can see little ticks appear where the new particles are being spawned. Now, this might not be perfect, but the distribution of the feathers in relation to the crows looks pretty good to me. Of course, we want the particles to be actual feathers, and lucky for me, the crow model my brother gave me also included a simple feather object. In particle flow, again, I added a shape instance object to my event and set it to be the crow feather. I also added a speed operator to make the feathers move downwards. I could also have set up a gravity force for that, but the speed operator just seems simpler. I also added a spin operator to make the feathers spin. Just like with the crows, I added a collision test and added my pier deflector into it. Now, however, I did not want my feathers to bounce, so I set the collision type to stop. One thing that particle flow allows you is to transition your particles to a new state when a certain event occurs. So when the feathers hit the pier, I want them to transition into a rested state. This new state, which I transition to on collision, includes a spin operator with a spin rate of 0, causing the feathers to stop spinning when they touch the ground. I also added this material operator and reassigned the same crow material to my feather particles because it changed when entering this new event state. Finally, I also changed the type of my display to geometry so I can still see the feathers properly in my preview window. Playing back the animation yet another time, we can see the feathers being spawned and sink to the ground nicely. Once they hit the ground, they stop moving and accumulate, just like what would happen if you scared a whole bunch of birds by running into them and waving your arms around wildly. However, the feathers fall down in a perfectly straight line, which would never happen if you dropped a real-life feather. And because I'm picky, I added yet another element to my project, and that is another force, a wind. Just like with the Vortex, you can find this force in 3ds Max under Space Warp's Forces. Returning to particle flow, I added the force operator into my feathers main event and linked it to the wind. I jacked up the influence parameter because I wanted my wind to have a strong effect on the feathers. What the wind force does to the feather particles is it swirls them around in a random fashion as if their movement was affected by a real wind. This adds much more natural movement to the feathers as they are sinking to the ground amidst a large amount of crows lifting off. Finally, because we don't want to render the huge sphere we set up to spawn the feathers, I disabled it by unticking the renderable option in the object properties. Let's render out a test frame before we commit to rendering out the entire animation. Wow, big ass wing on the right side of the screen, but I'd say the scene looks pretty good, so we're ready to render it out. Go to your render settings and make sure your output range is set to the entire active segment or however many frames you need. Ensure your resolution is sufficiently high for compositing in After Effects and make sure you properly set up your renderer. As I mentioned, I am using V-Ray, but there's nothing stopping you from using any of the other renderers available in 3ds Max. As I recommend you always do, I also set up a Z-depth pass to be rendered out. I specified my output directory and set up the Z-depth min and Z-depth max parameters to the closest and furthest distance from any crow to the camera during the animation. In the main tab, ensure that you set the output to production quality and your camera view and hit the render button. Once rendering is complete, which took overnight on my computer, you should end up with an image sequence showing nothing but your crows and their shadows shooting out gradually from bottom to top of where Celina is standing. With this, we're done with 3ds Max, and in the next part I'm going to show you how to finish off your effect inside of Adobe After Effects. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Make sure to stick around for the next part where I will show you how to composite your rendered crows onto your original footage inside of Adobe After Effects to finish off your dissolve in the crows effect. If you have any comments, questions or suggestions, just leave them in the section below. If you'd like to show some support, please subscribe, hit that like button, share it around, and if you're hungry for more, you can also find and follow me on Facebook or Twitter. Until next time, I will see you later.